I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be my wrap-up of the past couple of weeks. I took a week off, I think, from doing wrap-ups. I've been playing a lot of Wolfenstein, so I didn't feel like I was either reading enough or wanted to use my free time doing that instead of making videos. So the first thing that I read after my last wrap-up was The King of Attolia, which is the third and final volume in Whalen Turner's Thief of Attolia series. I think that's what it's called. I'm not actually sure. This one is, rather than being told from the perspective of the thief, is told by his personal guard. I liked it, but it has been so long since I read the second one that there were points that I think were trying to be made by using this third-party character that I think I ended up missing a lot of because I didn't remember what the established character traits were of some of the other characters because it's been several years since I read the last one. So it struck me as being less clever than I think it would have been if I'd had the previous volumes immediately in mind. But it was still a reasonably standard fantasy story. And I did like being able to see more of a common man's view of the royal household, so it was entertaining in that way. And I liked that that guard didn't end up becoming royalty or something at the end, because I think that's a standard in fantasy that's quite overdone. I didn't think it was spectacular, but I definitely thought it was good enough. Next up, I read a graphic novel called Namesake. This was written by Steve Orlando and drawn by Jakub Rebelka. It got its start as a 4-issue miniseries. It is, I think, one of the few creator-owned works that Steve Orlando has done lately. This book, I think, would have been a lot better if it were slightly longer, if it had been a 6-issue series rather than a 4-issue series, or alternatively, if it had lost a lot of the side plots. The central idea in here is that it's set in an Earth where every 7 years a parallel world becomes accessible for a week, and people cross over between the two. And in this story, it is the point where you can cross over, and the main character has been recently told that his fathers are both dead, and he's been asked if he can take their urns to the other universe to be buried, because one of them was a human from Earth, and one of them was an alien from this other world. And if that had been the core plot, I think there would be no problem with fitting everything into the 4 issues. But there were a number of side issues where he's working out his relationship with his roommate and a bit of extra backstory. There are some random encounters in here that don't really lead to anything. And I think that's great for flavor and for world building. And again, if this had been a 6-issue series, I think that would have worked out more, but there just wasn't enough time for any of those side plots. So I really liked the core idea of this, and I could really see how you could do interesting things in this universe if they ever wanted to return to this to do another story. But as it was, there was too much going on, and it wasn't long enough to really get into any of that. Still, I quite enjoyed it. I like the art style, although I don't know that it's for everyone. It is stylistic in a way that the faces don't always look great. I was reasonably entertained. I did actually read one physical book, and that was Junot Díaz's This Is How You Lose Her. This is a series of short stories, some of which are about his usual character, Junior, a couple of which are about other characters, but they're all about men who self-sabotage their own relationships and don't make good husbands, boyfriends, partners, etc. There's one of the stories is from a female perspective, and I read some of the reviews on Goodreads, and some people were saying that it almost sounded male to them, and I didn't find that at all, so I guess that depends on what you consider to be a authentic female versus male voice. This was a really quick read for me. I really enjoyed it. I found it extremely compelling. I don't have a lot to say about this beyond that, because now, I think I read this a week and a half ago, and I no longer remember that much about it, so while I definitely really enjoyed this while I was reading it, it hasn't particularly stuck with me, except in the general sense of, here's a book of stories about men losing their women. And after that we got into November, and of course we've got nonfiction November coming on, so I started in with a few memoirs. So the first one that I picked up was an audiobook, and it was Alan Cumming reading his own memoir, which is Not My Father's Son, which is both a story of his experience being on Who Do You Think You Are, the genealogy TV series, and also that while he was shooting that, he was going through an actual family drama with his father, who was extremely abusive when he was a child. This was incredibly depressing, but I was impressed with how nice Alan Cumming comes off as being to not just his mother and his grandmother and his brother and his husband and his ex-wife, but even to his father and even to people who were not particularly nice. It was touching, I would say. It was also incredibly depressing in a lot of ways. The story is interwoven between the present, the past, the family drama, and the TV series that they're shooting. So if you've seen his episode of Who Do You Think You Are, the TV series bits that do use a bit of suspense building of what are we going to find out about my grandfather? If you've seen the show, you know what they're going to find out about his grandfather. But nonetheless, I thought this was great, and I ended up recommending this to my mother, who is not a particular fan of Alan Cumming, but who loves Who Do You Think You Are? Finding Your Roots and all those kind of related shows. So I do think if you're a fan of the series, this does have some behind-the-scenes stuff, but I wouldn't watch his episode or rewatch it right before reading it, because that would make it a little repetitive. After that, I picked up Ghost Boy by Martin Pistorius. The subheading on this one is The Miraculous Escape of a Misdiagnosed Boy Trapped Inside His Own Body, which, if you've seen any of the interviews regarding this, it's the author's memoir of in part, his teenage years, which he spent with what is not quite what gets called locked-in syndrome, but is very similar to that, in that everyone thought he was profoundly mentally disabled, and as a result he was in a care home during the day and basically watching Barney for hours on end for 10 years, which I think is probably a lot of people's nightmare. And also during that time he was really horribly abused by a lot of the care workers in this residential home. And it wasn't until he was in his 20s that someone realized that he was responsive and got him assisted communication devices, and he was eventually able to finish high school and finish university and get married. So it is horrific in bits, because I think for a lot of people it would be a nightmare to be completely conscious and have no one realize that you're completely conscious. But also he makes a great point when he's talking about the abuse, that the abuse is not wrong because he knew it was happening or because he was intelligent enough. The abuse is wrong because don't abuse people. So I liked that he explicitly made that point. I thought this could have been structured a lot more compellingly, but just the story on its own is so compelling that it doesn't particularly bother me that it wasn't structured particularly well. It's a memoir of something that I don't think we see very often. And then finally, I've been reading Tales from the Sides of the Brain by Michael S. Gazzaniga. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He developed a lot of the early studies that looked at split brain patients who had had the connections between their left and right hemispheres divided to help with epilepsy. The original studies of that had said there were not any particularly dramatic changes caused by this, and he was one of the people who created a lot of the tests that showed that there were dramatic differences, and that effectively the brains were two separate things, and a lot of that which we take for granted now. And apparently there were other people working on similar studies at the same time, and he is actually very open about that and about how a lot of this was developing in parallel, and I thought that was quite interesting. This is not an overview of his work. He's written a couple of other books that do more of a general overview of those studies, so if that's what you're looking for, you would go for those, not this. This was not, to be honest, super compelling as a memoir. I was fascinated by the number of people he remembers. He'll talk about lab technicians that he worked with 50 years ago, and I was incredibly impressed that he still has so much respect for lab technicians, who I feel like a lot of researchers kind of ignore, but also that he knew their names and had funny stories about a lot of them. And he goes through a lot of acknowledging of colleagues that he worked with, including sometimes grad students who left the field. So I was very impressed with how much respect he gave to all kinds of different people, and similarly to the actor memoir, that he gives respect to his ex-wife, which I'm always impressed when people are able to talk about failed relationships in a polite and respectful way. Maybe that's holding people to too low of a standard. And even he will sometimes talk about other researchers whose findings he disagrees with, or whose interpretations of findings he disagrees with, and he is still very respectful of them. So this, I'm going to say, was, as a cohesive story, this wasn't particularly compelling, unfortunately. There are a lot of interesting bits and pieces in here, but as a whole, I think if you're interested in his work, I would read one of the books that he's written about his work. If you're interested in an academic way in his work, you can go read the articles that he's written, or that his teams have written. If you're really interested in him, I think the Wikipedia page is just as good. But as I said, I was really impressed by all the people he acknowledges in this. It's just that that doesn't really make for a particularly compelling read. So that's been my past couple of weeks. I guess the question I would have for other people is, how do you feel about memoirs, and what do you look for in a good memoir? Are you looking for story and experience? Are you looking for their opinions about other things? Or are you looking for a good narrative? Because I felt like in both of those last ones, they didn't 100% succeed on the linked narrative, but were both interesting in other ways. Yeah, I'd be curious to know what you look for in a memoir. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.